it felt horrifying, and I was terrified to learn that I had been raised in an experiment. And at the same time, that discovery was my hope. It was my hope for recovery myself. Maybe I'm not broken. Maybe the problem isn't just that there's something wrong with me because it's not her and it's not her and it's not him. So maybe there's something bigger going on that is outside of me.
If you were taught that your entire self-worth depends on your sexual purity or your sexual performance, that isn't just tradition, that is purity culture trauma. Today, we are looking at the binary trap of sexual shame, why religious trauma makes you feel broken even after you leave, and how to actually start dismantling purity culture to find healing. In today's conversation, I sit down with Linda Kay Klein, the author of Pure, to talk about the high-functioning trap of sexual dysfunction, why we feel isolated, and how to reclaim your story. And if you're new here, I'm Nikki P, and this is It's Both, a place where we find clarity in the tension of big life changes. So if you want tools for emotional intelligence and navigating these transitions, hit subscribe right now. Okay, let's get into the episode. I am really, really looking forward to today's conversation because I think I talk about purity culture, I don't want to say every day, but it is a major part of a lot of the conversation I'm having and also a lot of the conversations that I'm having with guests as we come on, specifically women. So I can't wait to get into our conversation today. And I'm just so grateful that you're here.
Yeah, this is going to be a good one. I really appreciate the frame that you are coming into this conversation with. So I'm excited about it.
Well, before we jump in, can you tell us just a little bit about who Linda is?
Ooh, oh my gosh, that's such a big question.
I know.
Who Linda is. And I feel like because you said Linda and not Linda Kay Klein, I feel like it's
hmm
like who am I really, not who is my
hmm
work self. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I am a mom of a 5-year-old. I also have a daughter who is 23. She's in the Peace Corps in Thailand. I am a writer and come alive when I'm writing or doing creative work. And so that's sort of my soul self. And I wrote a book called Pure Inside the Evangelical Movement that shamed a generation of young women and how I broke
hmm
free. And then that, which really involved, 20 years of research at this point, a number of things related to purity culture for 20 years. So that book has spurred this huge direction of my life, which has been to really support people as they deconstruct the really harmful teachings of purity culture and learn how to create lives of their own making and really let go of the lives that were created by others for them. And today I do that largely through coaching with people one-on-one.
It's kind of so amazing to hear all the different facets of who you are and what you've done and how kind of the culmination of all those different things kind of came together to spur something so needed and so powerful that I feel like anybody that has read your book, it just shifts something in their souls and in their life because you're giving language to something that I think many of us have experienced for so much of our life. And we didn't know, we weren't even aware that that's what it was or that that's what was happening. And we weren't even aware of all the ways it's now affecting us as adults.
Yeah, I do hear that from a lot of people. And for many years, I felt the same way. I felt so incredibly isolated and alone and without language for what I was experiencing, which is what led me to start doing the research.
Was it the research and starting to get into the research that started to give you that language, or how did you start to formulate that? Because I feel like that first moment of understanding is the hardest one to get to.
Yeah, for me, the ahas came through the research that was having conversations with other people who were raised in purity
Mm-hmm.
culture. And there were no books out there. There were no podcasts on this topic. The word purity culture didn't even exist when I started doing this work. It didn't exist until somewhat recently. So the research that I was doing beyond this kind of space of human exchange, was helpful and interesting, but it didn't show me what was happening to me. It was in conversation with other people that I started to be able to almost hear myself. Like, I love that phrase, you can hear one another into speech. So there was something about hearing myself and other people's stories and about them being heard by me and our sort of back and forth sharing of often stories that we had never told anyone before, our deepest secrets, our deepest shames, that I started to be able to understand there's something much, much bigger going on here. In fact, it's bigger than my youth group, which is how I started. I started by going back to my own youth group and doing a year of interviews with everyone I could find who had been raised a girl alongside me over a 10-year range. And I spent a year just talking to those folks. But then when I started talking to people around the country and around the world, I was like, this is not this is not the small thing that I
Mm-hmm.
suspected it might be in the early days. This is a
Yeah.
national movement. This is a global movement that has resulted in people telling shocking stories that are all the same, right? There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
variation. We experience things differently, but I really noticed some really stark shared themes very early on. And the more interviews I did, the more conversations I had with people, the more that those themes became clearer and clearer and more crystallized. And that's really what I think led me to develop that language. It was just through observation and grouping and starting to understand what might have been an anomaly and what most definitely wasn't, because I had heard it, 10, 20, 30 times.
I can only imagine the aha moment or the realization that, oh my gosh, this is so big. And
Oh,
was
yeah.
that both validating and also, oh my gosh, this is so big. This is like scary and sad how big that this is. Because I would imagine I would feel this bothness of going, I'm really sad that it's this big. That's terrifying and saddening, but it's also relieving because I'm not alone in this. Like, this is not just my experience. This is actually something that many people understand.
Yeah, that's actually so well said, given the theme of your podcast on bothness, right? Because that is exactly how it felt. It felt horrifying, and I was terrified to learn that I had been raised in an experiment that I think was an absolute failure, and that so many other people had as well. So there was a lot of, being overwhelmed by the information that I was learning and how much it hurt so many people. And at the same time, that discovery was my hope, right? It was my hope for recovery myself. This idea that I wasn't alone is what allowed me to say, okay, maybe I'm not broken. Maybe the problem isn't just that there's something wrong with me and that therefore I will never be healthy and I will never have a healthy relationship and I will just be broken my entire life and alone and no one will ever understand me, to wait, there are others out there. So maybe it's not me, right? Because it's not her and it's not her and it's not him. So maybe there's something bigger going on that is outside of me that I can contend with and make sense of and pull apart and decouple from my selfhood, that would allow me to actually be a healthy human being and have healthy relationships again, or for the first time.
Oh my gosh, you just said decouple from my selfhood. And I was like, that's it. That is the perfect sentence. I think that encompasses what we're talking about here. And I think most of my listeners are going to know what purity culture is, but if there's any chance that somebody listening doesn't know what that is, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say purity culture?
I would see a purity culture as any culture that teaches that people, and in particular women and girls, their worth is defined by their gender performance and their sexuality, including how others perceive their sexuality. So the language might be purity, but in other cultures that I would consider purity cultures, the language is different. So in the Church of Latter-day Saints, the language is worthiness. In Islam, the word is honor. You are
Mm.
honorable or dishonorable. So there's other language in other cultures, but generally speaking, when people think about purity culture, they're thinking about the culture that uses that term purity, which is the white American evangelical Christian church in particular, though there are other cultures that use that language as well.
Mm-hmm.
But that is the subculture that said, hey, we're going to take this notion that people, and in particular, again, women and girls, are either pure or impure, worthy or unworthy, honorable or unhonorable, dishonorable, lovable or impossible to love. going to end up happy and healthy or end up miserable and alone or lucky to be loved and always living in a state of shame or whatever. We're going to take this notion that we've been teaching for a really long time, and we're going to build something out of it. So in the early 1990s, you see that particular subculture build what I would call the purity movement. And the purity movement is when we start to see all of this heavily monetized, and we see purity pledges, purity balls, purity rings, all the different purity stuff, purity concerts, purity conferences, purity curricula in public schools, in churches, as part of HIV international aid, just absolutely just spread globally in this incredibly intentional way. So that's generally what people are referring to when they say purity culture.
Yeah. And even media. I mean, I'm thinking of back when I was born in 90. So grew up in the 90s and early 2000s where I feel like it was so big then, even pop stars. I remember the Jonas Brothers is just, I know that's like the easiest example I can think of, but I'm going, I remember when that was a huge deal. And it was, when you said monetize, I go, I never thought of it that way, but you're right, because it became a fad. It just turned into something that blew it up in an even bigger way. And when you're explaining it too, can you give some examples of somebody in these different cultures, whether we're saying purity culture or honor or whatever we're saying, what are those typical expectations of a female in that space versus a male?
Yeah, well, a female expectations would be non-sexuality. So that's different, of course, than asexuality, but just you shut it down, right? But there's this assumption that girls and women actually don't have a sexuality to shut down, most of us, that we just aren't very interested in sexuality, that we'd rather have a nice long conversation and a hug. And, that's really what we care about. So there's this sort of presentation, first of all, that there's like should be an ease to your non-sexuality.
Yes.
You can't have any sexual thoughts, you can't have any sexual feelings, you can't have any sexual desires, and that should be easy. And if it's not easy, then there's something wrong with you. Maybe you'll have a little bit of desire, but it's small enough that it should be easy. So that already creates a layer of shame among people who have sexual thoughts and feelings and desires. And then, of course, no sexual action. And that includes masturbation, which, people, girls and women would have been told things like, you'll ruin yourself for your future husband. And therefore, you'll have a terrible sexual life. Just all kinds of threat stories for girls and women, masturbation in particular. And then any sexual contact. And there was never any conversation in purity culture, certainly during the purity movement, around consent. So there was this, it was just an invisibility. So it fell into the same categories as all other sexual quote unquote activity or contact. And you really see that when you read the Bible college's manuals, and they actually do categorize rape and other forms of sexual violence as under the heading of sexual sin very often, right next to having sex before marriage, consensual sex before marriage, and not in the section that is on violence and battery. And then there's this other category of never inspire a sexual thought in anyone else. So that means wear the most modest thing you can. Anytime anyone had a thought about you, it was your fault. So you must have been smiling at them too much. Perhaps your eye contact was too long. Perhaps you appeared to be flirting, etc. And then there's this whole other category that was just gender. So in many ways, since you're asking about girls and women, I did talk about the sexual expectations for them, but if you were talking about the expectations in general, I would have started with gender because the teachings are so different. Again, this is a very binary, not a both and culture. So we're talking about boys and girls in that culture, right? So the teachings are very different for those two populations, and they are taught along gender lines. A girl or woman, in addition to all of those non-sexual things that I just shared, would also be taught that you need to be pretty and you need to be girlish and you need to be submissive and you need to not cause problems and not upset anybody and be a supporter and a helper and a cheerleader. And don't be one of those annoying, boxy, know-it-all feminists.
And what about, and you framed this so well because you're right, in this culture and in this framing, it is so binary. And so there is men women, boy, girl. And with that framing, what was the other side given? What was it like for boys or for
Yeah.
men?
Well, boys and men would have been taught that their sexuality was inevitable and that it was, in fact, part of their God-given masculinity. They had a sexual voraciousness. They had a sexual hunger that was good because it was kind of proof that they were manly men. And they had to be so manly as to even overpower, as to be stronger than even that.
Yeah.
And so they were also taught to be non-sexual, but masturbation was handled in a very different way. It depended so much upon what group they were in. Some evangelical purity culture leaders who actually taught that men and boys could masturbate and it was healthy.
Oh, interesting.
And then there were others who assigned a lot of shame to it. And then there was this kind of like, majority, which is, it kind of talked about it as it's complicated. Yes, this is an ongoing sin and you need to work on it, but God will forgive you and you're not ruined by it. You just have to try harder. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
women and girls would have been taught that purity culture would change your makeup. You would become less of
Mm-hmm.
a pure person who would have a good life, right? Men and boys were given kind of an out of confession and even, it depending on what group they were in, right? Because it varied so much because it was more complicated for them. Even yes, this is natural and normal, but you have to be better. And then when it came to sexual activity, it was the same thing. It was like, you shouldn't be sexual before marriage, men and boys. But again, if you are, God will forgive you. We get it.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of your God-given, you know, sexual monstrosity, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
not your responsibility to control that. First and foremost, it's women and girls' responsibility to control that
Yeah.
because they actually have a very easy time with sexuality. And so, so there was a very different relationship to it. Not to say that I don't know plenty of men, and I work in my coaching practice with mostly women, but I work with a number of men as well. And I know many men who have been harmed by purity culture in a number of ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including some ways that are are not as straightforward because it is such a complicated teaching for them. But the teachings were certainly softer for men and boys, and there was
Mm-hmm.
a lot more room for them to be embodied creatures.
Yes, I mean 100%. I'm thinking back to my youth group and going, I remember church leadership and youth group. So the older boys they were over 18, they were leading worship and they were doing these things. They were in leadership for youth group. And it was known that the couple in particular had had sex with multiple people. And it was kind of like, yeah, he's working through it. He's doing these things. And then there would be, and this happened all the time, there would be a girl and it would come out that she had sex or maybe not even sex, just kissed or whatever with somebody, some level of sexuality was experienced, and immediately was like, well, she's the slut. She's the one.
Hmm.
I mean, it became so harsh. I mean, language around sluttiness or like all these other really awful terms that we use towards a woman who's experiencing sexuality versus leadership, a man in leadership. And we're just kind of like, oh, that's his struggle.
Yeah.
What's he going to do?
Yep. Yep.
And it just breaks my heart because and that's just one instance. But I think back to even as you're talking and going, I remember being taught over and over and over, to your point, it was our responsibility. It was how we looked, it was how we dressed. And we kind of, as a culture, it feels like tell men. When I think about the psychology of this, I go, well, of course, when you tell somebody that their sexuality is so massive that they can't control it and that's how they've grown up, of course they're going to think of their sexuality in that way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You're telling somebody that something is, and they grow up in that. And of course, it's going to seem like this quote monster that you can't control. And same for women in a different way. And so when you think about the effects of purity culture, how does that show up in adolescence? In the
Mm,
youth who was experiencing that, like what did the negative side effects of that look like for us in our adolescence?
yeah. It's such a great question. Just briefly, I want to backtrack for just a second and say even that, speaking of binaries versus kind of a broader, more complex, nuanced
Yeah.
frame, when you have an overly dualistic frame, you're always leaving people out, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
dualistic frame on
Yeah.
you are sexual or you're not sexual, left out all of these sexual violence survivors,
Mm.
perpetrators, right? So they got categorized in these very inappropriate ways. And it also left out all kinds of queer people, right? Who
Yeah.
were just
Yeah.
invisible within that world. So I want to start there because how it impacted adolescence, I think, depended so much on whether you identified with the binary, with the gender binary or not.
Mm. Yeah.
So if you were someone and the all sexuality is consensual sort of implication of that culture. So if you were somebody as an adolescent who had experienced sexual violence, which is outrageously common even among children, you would not see yourself in these teachings in any specified way. And I've heard so many stories about girls seeing themselves in particular growing up as, there's something wrong with me. I'm broken. I'm never
Mm-hmm.
going to have a healthy relationship. I'll never be loved. I'm impure. I'm dirty. I'm unclean. I can't talk about this. Then everyone will know I'm impure, right? Certainly that's bigger than purity culture, but purity culture, really hammers the cultural teachings on that down. So there
Yes.
are a lot of adolescents who were really struggling because of their experience. There are also a lot of adolescents who were really struggling because they were queer, because they weren't attracted to the population that they were being framed as being inevitably attracted to, because they didn't identify with the gender binary. Not even exclusively queer teens, but even just people who didn't identify for other reasons, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Who just didn't feel strongly, like this is how I express my true self, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think for people who didn't fit into these frames, there was a great deal of shame and isolation. Though I will say, for many queer people, purity culture became a closet
Hmm.
because you were taught to be non-sexual.
Yeah.
And so what a great label to hide
Hmm.
behind when you do not want anyone to find out who
Yes.
your sexuality attracted. Well, no worries.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wearing a purity ring, right? So this is why you never hear me talking about guys
Mm-hmm.
or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that is also very common and something that I've heard a lot from a lot of people, that it kind of stunted their ability, or almost like it allowed them to stunt their ability to think about their sexuality in any meaningful way. But then I would say there were others who did fit into these expectations, and it more or less, not that I feel like nobody really fit in perfectly,
Mm-hmm.
right? But
Yeah.
but I think for people who could fit more into it, there was often a real sort of like, got it. You gave me the pathway to be right
Mm-hmm.
and good and have a good life. Excellent, right? This is what I wanted. And, I think about, again, coming back to bothness, I think about how, when we're growing up before our brain has finished developing, cognitive dissonance is very difficult for us. It's very difficult
Mm-hmm.
for us to have two things be true at once and to have them not make sense together. So youth are are really they really resonate with overly simplistic frameworks because that's
Mm-hmm.
just where their brain development is at.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they think through the lens of binary. They think through the lens of give me a math equation for a good life, right? And I'll
Mm-hmm.
plug
Mm-hmm.
in X and Y and end up with Z. And so for I think a lot of people, they didn't necessarily even understand while they were in it the damage that it was doing to them because they were so consumed by checking the boxes and doing
Mm-hmm.
everything right and being good and winning at life.
Yes. Yeah.
you know? And then there were others like myself who in the early days I fit in more than I did as I started to become more developed as a human being. And as I became more developed physically, I felt myself experiencing a great deal more shame
Mm-hmm.
And as my personality developed, I found myself being sexualized uh, a lot, right? And pulled aside or told I was doing things wrong, or talking to the boys too much, or wearing the wrong thing too much. So that combination of my personality and my body developing took me out of this this acceptability period that I got to experience as a white girl who fit into the gender expectations, and was pretty young, right? And then I started to become somebody who didn't quite belong. And that was something that I really wrestled with even within it. And I know that plenty of other people do as well. They feel the dissonance. They feel
Mm-hmm.
the unconditional love that people tell them is there, and they
Mm-hmm.
feel the deep conditionality of that quote unquote unconditional, right?
Yes.
And so for a lot of young people, I think that even as adolescents, they start to sit with that both andness.
Okay, quick pause here because I want to share something that I've been working on. Alongside of this show, I'm launching a companion podcast called It's Both: Guided Meditations for Anxiety, Emotional Regulation, and Real Life Transitions. It's a place for when you don't want more advice or analysis, just a guided way to slow down, notice what you're feeling, and come back into your body. These meditations are grounded and for real life, some shorter, some longer, and they're not about emptying your mind or fixing yourself. So if that sounds helpful, you can search It's Both: Guided Meditations wherever you listen. The links are below in the show notes as well. Okay, now let's get back to the episode. Well, and as you're talking about cognitive dissonance, I'm thinking, and I don't know if you've talked to others who have experienced this, it's still hard for me to articulate. I don't quite know the best language to say it, but one of the ways I felt like it showed up for me in adolescence and even as an adult is this very odd experience of feeling both so insecure and so ugly and not good enough and all these things that you dislike about yourself, and that I am too attractive and too pretty and I need to cover up. I can't dress too nicely because there will be too much attention, and I can't wear a bikini because that will get attention. But in the same moment going, why would I get attention? Have you seen my body? And this utter experience of feeling those two things at once. And I think a lot of it, I don't have any research behind this, but from my own processing and what I know, I go, I think a lot of that came from this idea of purity culture, this idea of how I grew up, what a woman does, what a man does, what a woman's body should do, what a man's body should do, and what I'm here for, and all these things. And it's one of those things, I don't quite know how to articulate it, but you feel all of that in the same moment. And especially, I think, those who have experienced some form of sexual violence or exploitation, it's even more heightened because you both feel not good enough and you are so close to being too attractive, you might attract the wrong kind of attention that would then hurt you again. And so I don't know if
Yeah,
have you seen that? Have you experienced that or heard that similar experience?
yeah, I do hear that all the time, and that often it's one of the reasons, one of the ways in which sometimes differ from some people who talk about purity culture is there's a big norm within purity culture recovery to talk to people about how good they are. And they say, you grew up being told that you're a worm, right? Because that's certainly what
Hmm.
high control religion teaches. You grew up believing that you were worthless and deserved hell, and that the only
Yeah.
reason you weren't going to go is because God was so good and gave you so much grace that you will be saved, right?
Hmm.
But you don't deserve it. So there is just this like deep teaching of worthlessness. And a lot of people, come out of high control religion with this overwhelming feeling of worthlessness. And the other thing, though, that people I think aren't catching when they then respond to that by saying, so we're going to tell you you're good. That's one of the kind of things that I hear a lot in purity culture recovery. You're not worthless. You are good. You are good. You are good. Repeat it to yourself a million times a day, right? But what they're missing is the both and, because we also would have grown up with all kinds of different versions so you gave a great perfect example of one. You're too attractive, but you're also disgusting. But there's also, you're a worthless worm, but you're also
Mm-hmm.
one of the good ones and one of the saved ones and one of the holy ones and one of the pure ones and one of the ones who are going to go to heaven. And you're also better than it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So people walk away, feeling this complexity, right? And the more power you have within that culture, right? So in particular men, I think the more that like I am good kind of puffs them up and excuses some pretty not so good behavior, right? So there is in a million different ways within that culture, these contradictions of what you're taught, not just from theological contradictions, which are a big part of the culture, right?
Yes.
Like you have free will and things are predestined, right? But there's also all kinds of contradictions about your own worth, right? So I often walk away, from this complexity saying it's the binary that's the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is worthless. And also nobody is good. you know,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
like we shouldn't have to do that to ourselves,
Mm.
destroy ourselves to never feel anger or express anger or a million other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
In reality, we just are. Like we just are people with all of it. And I do, by the way, just want to say, I think that there is something useful though when you really have internalized the worthlessness to such an extreme to
Mm-hmm.
swing to the other end of the pendulum and really mantra that I am good, not so you can stop there though, so you can get to the eventual I am, right? Because I think if you really have fully internalize that I am disgusting, my sexuality is disgusting, my body is disgusting, I am a worm, I deserve hell, right? If you really are living in that deeply, I don't think you can go straight to I am, right? You have to get some momentum and swing up into self-love. But I also think that, and I've worked with some clients who the worthlessness is not where they landed.
Mm-hmm.
It's a more complex story, right? So we really need to wrestle with like the whole binary. But yes, you are absolutely not alone in that experience. And, it makes sense that for you being able to name that growing up, that you would be working on what you are today.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing you said too that is such a beautiful articulation of this whole idea. Binary is not real in so many ways. I mean, it is, but it's not. You know what I mean? And when you grow up in a high control Christian environment or any religious environment, there is so much contradiction. There is so much bothness. But I think one of the biggest problems with it is, and you see this in purity culture in other areas, is there's contradiction, but we don't talk about the contradiction. We don't
Hmm.
talk about sitting with that tension of bothness. And when you don't talk about it, it creates this really, I don't want to say that, well, I'm just going to say it, this mind fuck of like,
Yeah.
wait a second, what? And because we don't talk about how these two things, which are seemingly opposite, are coexisting, I feel like without that language and acknowledgement, it just creates an internal tornado, is how I interpret it. And a lot of internalized anxiety and shame, not just because of the bothness, but I think because we're not acknowledging it. So we think there's something wrong with us. And it doesn't help us get to this higher level of understanding that, I mean, I think you said it so beautifully, I am. Because when I think either end, obviously we know what I am worthless does to somebody. But on the other end of that, we also have seen what I am just good. And I can mess
Absolutely.
up. I can treat someone without any ounce of respect or dignity. And it's okay. I'm good. It's okay.
Hmm.
I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
kind of releases
There's
you of the responsibility.
there's a study that people who believe they are good give less money.
What?
Yeah, so there is this
Oh man.
way in which the teachings of you are better than, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
is harmful too, right? Because there are so many contradictions, it it almost keeps you from ever being able to talk about anything real because if you were to bring something up, there's always one end to kind of push you, saddle you in, like some
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
spiritualized, like, well, God's in charge. There's just so many different frames. So that's like predestination. Well, you have free will, so you don't have to make that choice. Whatever it is, there's always a way to kind of
Mm-hmm.
keep you, if you ever bring up anything difficult, have any difficult questions, anything like that, you can get hemmed in from both sides, right?
Yes.
Because there are these contradictions, these unacknowledged contradictions. And
Mm-hmm.
so either way, it's like you have a multiplicity of ways that you're told to sit back down. And that I think also, leads to that internal tornado, or you deaden the tornado and you
Mm-hmm.
choose to only see the black and white and to not allow yourself to grow and to develop and to see the full complexity and nuance.
Yes, for sure. And I know we talked a little bit about the effects of purity culture show up in adolescence. Can you talk a little bit about how does that show up for us as adults who have moved out of it? Maybe some people listening haven't moved out of it, but what does that show up like in adulthood?
Well, one way it shows up is a real difficulty not thinking as through the lens of the Bible. So something that I sometimes see among people I work with is they'll reject the particular teachings that they were raised with, but they won't reject the binary as a whole, right?
Hmm.
So they'll maintain almost like a fundamentalist view, but they're applying it to different things. So, maybe I used to see myself as good and all of these people as bad. But now I'm realizing all of those people are bad and all of these people are good. So I just sort of swapped,
Ah,
right? But I'm
yes.
still holding on to the binary. I haven't questioned the binary as a whole. And that shows up in a million different ways in people's lives. People feeling like there's a right decision and a wrong decision. People coming to me and saying, how do I make sense of my husband really hurt me, but then I talked to him about it and he had this really reasonable, logical explanation that made a lot of sense. So something must be wrong with me.
Mhm.
And then I'll say, or it's all true. Yeah, he had a really logical explanation for it. And you were really hurt.
Mhm.
Like those can both be, really true. You can have a really sound explanation and he can have a really sound explanation. And that can be something that is hard to sit with, but you don't have to go back and forth between, is he the bad one or am I the bad one? No, 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 he's the bad one. No, I'm the bad
Mhm.
one. No, he's the bad one. No, I'm the bad one. Or sort of even questions about like career. I left this job. Was that the right choice or the wrong choice to leave that job? Did I do the right thing or did I do the wrong thing? There's that. Those were the only two options. It's not that it was a choice, right? Or that there are pros and cons to both. That's not something that people coming out of purity culture jump to straight away.
Mhm.
Instead, they're really saddled with this like, I have to live right and I just have to figure out what's right now and what's wrong now. And the church used to give me some indication of what was right and wrong, but now I have to figure out what's right and wrong. And everything is really high stakes and everything is really clear, either all right or all wrong. And I don't have a compass on how to figure it out. And so there is a lot of, I think the fear of living in a false binary, often is carried into people's lives after. And there is this real sort of softening that is required. This is, of course, just one of the things that shows up in adults' lives, but given the topic of your podcast, I wanted to start there. There is this real softening that is required as we release some of those notions and start to allow ourselves to sit with multiple realities and
Mhm.
ways of looking at things and really take ownership over the fact that then we are faced with the opportunity and the burden of making authentic choices as opposed to being guided into what is right or told what is right. You're figuring out what is right. We actually choose within the much messier space of complexity.
I think 100% you just described exactly probably one of the reasons I am pursuing this idea so much because it's been one of the hardest adjustments to come to, honestly, because I was so used to such black and white thinking and going, somebody give me the roadmap. I will do it. I will do it the best. I will be the
Mm-hmm,
best at being a Christian woman. I will do it.
mm-hmm,
And one other thing I was thinking is I would imagine a lot of this in adulthood also shows up as sexual dysfunction. Maybe that's not the right word, but struggling to embrace your sexuality regardless of your gender. Can you talk a little bit about how that shows up?
Yeah, that shows up in so many different ways. The first thing I would say before I get into some of the ways that it can show up in regards to sexuality is that people usually come to me for coaching because of something related to sexuality.
Mhm.
And what we almost inevitably discover is that whatever is showing up in the sexual sphere is showing up in other parts of their lives as well. So, so it is so much bigger than sexuality, even though purity
Yeah.
culture really is the section of high control religion that talks about sexuality a lot. These gender teachings, the high control religion in general, right? All of it creates these really deep challenges to healthy life. And so I'll start there by saying it's so big, like sexuality is a piece, but it's like the canary in the coal mine. Like people are
Mhm.
like, okay, I can handle this kind of sort of, but like I gotta talk to somebody about this thing. One way that I'm gonna start here, even though it's not like one of the top two or three ways, but I do have a number of people who have come to me with almost like being consumed by their partner's past. So they've bought into this idea that sexual experience makes a person less pure, right?
Mm.
And they don't hold it to themselves to it, but they hold their partners to it. And
Interesting.
when I see that among men, it makes a lot of sense. They're like, yeah, I have a sexual past, but what of it, right? But my female partner has a sexual past and I
Mm.
cannot get over it.
Yeah.
So it fits right into those teachings. But I also see it among women. And when I see it among women, what it often is about is this feeling of, if they've ever had a sexual past before me, it's an indication that I am not what I was promised, the one and only true love that you could never even think of anyone else because I am it, right? And that is what we were promised in purity culture. We were promised that we would be the quote unquote princess, right?
Mhm.
And that we would be the one and only who could ever satisfy, who could ever meet the needs. We were taught to not think about dating by obsessing over marriage and writing letters to our future husband and talking about what, again, binary husband, right? But, like, and obsessing over what our husband would look like and act like and how they would treat me and all of this stuff. And so through that lens, the existence of anyone in someone's past or even the existence of other people in the reality of just living life, like did you look at that person? Did I see you look at that person? Like it can create this real sense of distrust. And the distrust often leads to this feeling of what we were taught in purity culture. If you're not the one and only prize one, then you are being used. You are not really loved. You're not really cared about. You are replaceable. You are disrespected. And so, that was the binary we were given on that, right? Either you're the most special one and only, or you are used and they don't really care and it's all just a game, right?
Mhm.
So that complexity can show up. A big thing that comes up, one of the most common things that shows up is I talk to people who have been playing by the purity culture rules for a really long time and then wake up one day and go, oh my gosh, when did I become 45 or
Mhm.
whatever age, right?
Yeah.
And when's God going to give me the reward?
Mm.
And then
Mhm.
it starts to fall apart and then there's terror over, can I actually enter into this world? How do I do that? Will I be judged and shamed? For a lot of women there is an inability to be sexual, and I would put that into different categories. One, there is an inability often to desire sexuality, and the often that if that isn't how it starts, even it can happen over the course of a relationship,
Mhm.
because either way, what women will also often do, having grown up in purity culture, is they'll fall into sexual duty. I'm going to have sex with you because it's my job. It's
Yes.
how I
Yeah.
earn, it's how I earn your love. It's how I earn your affection. It's how I make you be nice to me. And so there is this sort of sense of duty. Purity culture would literally teach people you're supposed to have sex a certain number of times a week. If you don't, they'll
Yeah.
cheat, they'll leave, they'll et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
So sometimes women have sexual desire and have sexual interest and pleasure, but then they do the duty thing, the days that they don't. And the
Hmm.
duty thing, that sexual duty thing will destroy libido. And so even for people who, had it at one point, the duty is such a dehumanizing experience, you know, that it becomes more and more difficult to want sex because the duty has just sort of traumatized it out of the person. Not to say that I'm using the word duty, which is different than like, well, I'm not quite in the mood, but maybe I could get in the mood. Let's see, right? That's
Right,
not
right.
sexual, right? Phew, what else? There's so many ways it manifests.
Yeah. No, it's
There's a lot. There's a lot. I'm missing a bunch, you know?
I mean, and that's even so much. And as you're saying that, I'm like, yes, yes, yes.
Here's a kind of a different category, so it might be, but like for people who were sexual before marriage, including survivors, there's often this feeling of like, when will the other shoe drop? When will you abandon me? When will you become the abuser? When will God take you from me by killing you or something? Because I don't deserve you, right? Because I was sexual, right? Which again,
Yeah.
sometimes was sexual, sometimes not. So I wouldn't use that word homosexual, but that's how people feel it often.
Yes.
So yeah, it can manifest in a whole lot of really problematic ways and harmful and heartbreaking ways. And then there's this category of people who have vaginismus and who cannot physically have sex because there is such a tightening of their body, of their physical muscles, there is physical pain, so on and so forth. There's a whole lot. There's a whole lot of ways that this can show up.
So, and even that example, you're saying not even from medical, like you go to see a doctor and they're like, there's nothing wrong. We can't figure out why this is occurring. But because of this unresolved, whether it be trauma or abuse or just experience or internalized sexuality and how you view yourself, that it affects your body in such a way that your body is like, no.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very common.
Wow. And I haven't heard of that, which is, I feel like I should know about, we should be talking about this more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
I hesitate to say the very common with such like the hard hit that I am because for a lot of people who start having sex later after deconstructing, they often are very worried they're going to experience vaginismus, and it's not a given, right?
Hmm.
But it is not uncommon for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. When I was thinking too about how this idea, again, the bothness of, I remember in purity culture and how it affected me as an adolescent and then as an adult, because I was married previously before my current husband. And I remember this idea of grew up in youth group with him that we were told, shut it down. Like you said earlier, you're not sexual. You just shut it down. You are non-sexual. And then when you
Mm,
get married, you are expected to be this sexual prowess. You're supposed to just
mhm.
know how to ooze sexuality and how to, I don't know, perform and meet all of his needs. And if you don't meet his needs, then he has the freedom to cheat on you. He has the freedom to leave you. He has the freedom to get his needs met because that's your job. And yeah, you said it duty earlier. And I go, how do we? It is such a long process of getting out of the immediate reaction that that is what you are
Mhm.
supposed to do as the good wife, woman. Again, this is very binary, talking about a man and a woman, husband and wife, but in my experience. So it's just so many ways to untangle what we learned when we were young. And I mean, I've been out of it for, oh my gosh, 15 years, maybe not quite 15, 10, 12, something like that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of men experience that too, this feeling of I'm supposed to be, now that I'm married, I'm supposed to be ravenous, sexually
Hmm.
ravenous.
Hmm.
And I'm supposed to want it more than her. And I'm supposed to like want it a certain number of times a week. And that is part of my masculine expectations too. I have a male clients who really feel like, there's something wrong with me because they just don't have as high of a libido as they were taught they inevitably did. So there really is in marriage, I see people really struggling with all of these assumptions that they internalized about what sexuality would be like, what their sexuality would be like, what their partner's sexuality would be like, you know, what was expected of them. Like we don't even realize we have these assumptions sometimes
Mhm.
it's almost like you just get into an environment where you've had deep, deep messaging and all of a sudden it just clicks right in, right? So yeah, you're so not alone in that experience as a woman. So many people have come to me talking about that and, really across the gender spectrum.
Mhm. What would you say to people who are wanting to unravel it, wanting to process it? How are some ways they can start to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I always think about recovery as kind of a three-part experience. The first part has got a point A and a point B, so we'll start there. And that is deconstruction, which is just like pulling apart all of the stuff that you were raised with, right? All the really invisible teachings as well as the visible teachings, right? Looking at them, making them separate from you, right? Being able to understand them as teachings and not just the way things are. So that deconstruction part, and then the other part of the first step, which by the way, I say the first step, but these all can happen simultaneously. But the second part of that is reconstruction, which is basically, and I think that deconstruction and reconstruction have to happen at the same time. You know, reconstruction is learning how to listen to yourself, learning how to feel the full range of your actual feelings, not just the feelings that were deemed acceptable by society and therefore you learned to have, versus the feelings that were deemed unacceptable and therefore you learn to internalize and push down and not even become aware of. So, learning to
Mhm.
feel your full range of feelings, learning to be able to feel your physical sensations externally, like, the full range of what it feels like to feel the wind on your skin, to, what does it feel like when I'm upset? Oh, my stomach goes into a knot, right? Oh, the back of my neck got really hot when I was scared, right? So these physical sensations, the feelings and the physical sensations are cues and clues into what you actually think and feel and believe and want and need, right? So learning those things and then starting to be able to from there identify and hearing the self-talk too. And from there, being able to identify, okay, what choices do I actually want to make, right? How do I want to live my life? What is true for me? What is authentic for me? And then learning to make those choices. So the deconstruction, reconstruction, I like them happening at the same time because deconstruction hurts and you'll shut down if you're just doing it without reconstruction, and reconstruction feels amazing. The second piece, which I think is really, really important, is joining a community of solidarity. And that doesn't have to look like a physical community. It doesn't even have to look like people you talk with, but it's moving from this feeling of I am isolated, I'm alone, no one's like me, no one understands me, so I can't talk about this, into I have solidarity with other people. I'm not the only one who experiences this. There are people like me. If possible, have some conversations with those people, meet those people online, listen to podcasts in which those people are talking. But it's about building a community of solidarity and moving out of an experience of aloneness. And then the third one, and this one actually is chronological, like this one does need to go, I think, last. And that is, being part of other people's healing. I think
Hmm.
that's part of the healing process as well. I think people jump to it too soon coming out of evangelicalism because we were raised to be helping and saving people. But, work like what you're doing right now, right? There's something inherently healing about about, doing something for others that makes it bigger than you as well. But that doesn't have to be as big as making a podcast. That could be as big as like talking to your sister about your experience. It could be maybe you're a nurse, and so talking to your fellow nurses about what vaginismus looks like and what some of the things are that might be showing up around it, right? It can look all kinds of different ways. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to, be a big voice. But I do think that when we're ready, finding ways that we can be part of, that we can have agency and choice and empowerment around recovery, beyond our own lives is really healing as well.
I love that so much. All three of those pieces, because all are so important. And I think, yeah, it is interesting how I think, to your point, a lot of us do jump to that step three very quickly, especially because of this growing up in a culture where, yeah, you have to go and save and evangelize and help. And not that those things are wrong. Again, that's not binary, but there's a lot of other things that need to come first before I think you can get to that step. So
Agreed.
I thank you so much for coming on, for being here, for all of the work that you're doing. It's so impactful. I am forever a fan of your book and all of your work, and will always talk about it and share it because of how impactful it is for everybody. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm really honored to hear you say that. Thank you.
And before we go, my very, very last question is, I ask all my guests, is there something you do that is ridiculous or relatable? A weird quirk? It could be an odd habit, anything like that. I will give you an example really quickly. I water down my milk, which sounds so weird. And basically, I don't like milk. I think it's too thick. And if I don't have my coconut milk around and I want some cereal, I will pour in the regular milk about 2/3 of the way. And then the rest of it I'll fill with water and mix it so it's not as thick. And
gosh.
it's so weird. And my husband thinks it's so gross, but it is something weird that I do.
Yeah, I have actually never heard anyone doing that.
Probably because I don't think anybody does it.
But I have heard people say milk is a weird texture in their mouths. And so I'm sure you're not alone because there's something about the mouthfeel of milk that some people really don't like. So
Yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
you're not alone. I'm sure you're not alone. I love that. Yeah, so I would say, well, I'm not sure if mine is relatable because I've never met anybody who has this quite like this, but I have a thing about ice where I really, really hate ice. Like I hate ice. So I grew up in Wisconsin. It was very icy, but the sound of ice in particular, like the sound of like boots sliding on ice, or I have these visceral, sharp memories of kids putting their fingernails down the bus window on ice.
Oh,
So I feel this like overwhelming like shudder through my body when I hear ice. So
okay.
when I have to get ice for somebody, it's like a real act of self-sacrifice in a way that I don't think that they understand, right? So
Are
like,
you talking about ice cubes?
yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
if I say to somebody, and I've noticed that when I'm doing it, I always go like this with my teeth. Like there's something like I'm like, oh, like I'm always doing that. I don't know why, but it's something that like it just feels. It's like I'm falling into myself. So yeah. So if somebody wants ice in their cup and I have to like get ice out of the ice tray, or like worse yet, like scoop ice out of the ice thing,
Uh-huh.
like it's a horrible feeling and I hate it. But I do it out of love.
That is such a good one. I love that one so much. And also, it does suck that it's such a common thing, though, because everybody wants ice in their drink. So
Ugh,
this
I
is like a
know.
daily sacrifice you're giving to people.
It really is. It really is a burden in my life.
That is so funny.
But I'll never have ice unless it's very, 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 very hot.
Okay. I will never offer you ice. If we are ever together in person for any reason, I will not. Well, thank you again so much for being here. I really enjoyed our time, and I could probably talk to you about this for hours and hours, but I'm just so grateful for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you again to Linda Kay Klein for today's conversation. You can learn more about Linda and her work by visiting her website, lindakayklein.com, or following her on Instagram at Linda Kay Klein. The links are also below in the show notes. If today helped, please follow the show and share it with a friend who's navigating a transition. Ratings and reviews on Apple really do help new listeners to find us. And just so you know, a quick peek at what's coming up. Next week, I'm doing a short solo episode about my conversation with Rob Bell and why it meant so much to me. You'll also hear the story behind the question that I sent him 10 years ago. And after that, I'm talking with Brian Recker, the author of Hellbent. So this week, take some time and think about what in your life is full of bothness. And remember, it's okay to feel all the things because so many times in life, it isn't either or. It's both.